In today's video, we're looking at 5 of the most terrifying pet attacks ever recorded. From a Bengal cat's redirected aggression inside a cramped apartment to a fatal stallion crush on a quiet Texas farm. But first, a routine enclosure cleaning with a pet python turns deadly. It was August 4th, 2017, in Columbus, Ohio. A humid stillness hung over the duplex, nothing outwardly unusual. Yet inside an upstairs bedroom, a series of overlooked choices was quietly aligning toward tragedy. Evan Marlowe had lived in the duplex for almost 3 years. At 29, he worked long shifts as a warehouse picker and kept a small collection of reptiles as a solitary hobby. The routine helped him unwind after unpredictable hours on the job. He wasn't careless, but his limited income often pushed him toward improvised enclosures and discounted feeder rats, which meant his Burmese python's feeding schedule never stayed consistent. Those who knew him described him as patient and methodical, someone who tried to do things correctly even when his resources fell short. The python, a 10-foot subadult female, was the center of his small collection. He had built her enclosure from plywood and plexiglass, proud of the craftsmanship, despite its occasional heating malfunctions. His neighbor Travis helped him check temperatures and missed the enclosure when Evan worked overtime. Travis later said that Evan had been mentioning the snake's growing restlessness. Her movements tracked hands through the glass more sharply, and she pressed against the enclosure door more frequently. None of this seemed alarming to them at the time, only signs that the snake was maturing and feeding more aggressively. The reptile room sat above the duplex's living area, warm and poorly ventilated. Faint scents of bedding, disinfectant, and thawed feeders lingered. Evan had cleaned the enclosure earlier, leaving chemical residue on his hands. The python hadn't eaten in 9 days, and Travis assumed the rustling sounds were routine. Burmese pythons are ambush predators that rely heavily on scent, heat, and movement. Even subadults around 10 feet can apply significant pressure, tightening in response to resistance rather than direct aggression. Their feeding response sharpens when food is irregular or when environmental cues, such as body heat or strong odors, mimic prey. In enclosed, warm spaces, misidentification can happen quickly, and without the dramatic displays often shown in media. In the hours leading up to the attack, several subtle warnings were present. The heating pad beneath the enclosure had been inconsistent for weeks, sometimes overheating. The snake had been pacing the enclosure more than usual the night before. And most notably, Evan had cleaned the enclosure without washing the disinfectant fully off his arms before handling her. Travis would later mention that the room smelled strongly of cleaning agents when he entered it that afternoon. Each of these factors contributed to a heightened feeding response state in the python, though none seemed alarming enough for Evan to pause. He had handled her dozens of times without trouble, and experience often breeds misplaced confidence. As Evan lifted the snake from the temporary holding bin to return her to the enclosure, the first coil tightened around his forearm. Evidence suggests she registered the warmth and scent on his skin as prey contact. The sequence happened quietly. A muffled thud traveled through the wall, followed by the scrape of feet against the wooden floor. That was when Travis entered the room. He found Evan partially collapsed against the bed frame, the python already wrapped twice around his torso with a third coil tightening along his upper arm. Travis later described the movements as methodical rather than chaotic. Each time Evan tried to shift or pull away, the snake's grip cinched tighter in short, deliberate increments consistent with constrictor feeding behavior. Her jaw was braced near his elbow, not attempting to bite, but anchoring for leverage. The room was warm, and both men were sweating as Travis tried to wedge a broom handle between the coils. The attempt only triggered additional tightening. The snake responded to pressure with more pressure. Evan's struggle weakened within minutes, his back pinned against the edge of the mattress. The python maintained her position, still coiled, breathing slowly and evenly. Travis called emergency services, leaving the phone on speaker as he continued trying to create space between the coils and Evan's chest. Responders arrived with animal handling tools, cooling spray, and alcohol swabs to disrupt the snake's grip. They worked deliberately, peeling each coil off with coordinated pressure until they freed Evan's torso and removed the final loop from his arm. Evan did not regain consciousness. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene from compressive asphyxia. His phone was found on the floor beside the bed, screen cracked from the initial fall. The temporary holding bin remained open, suggesting he intended only a brief transfer. The python, once fully uncoiled, appeared lethargic from exertion. She was transported to a small rehabilitation facility, where staff noted early signs of metabolic bone disease, likely tied to inconsistent feeder nutrition and the prolonged temperature issues that had affected her digestion. State agriculture officers later confirmed that Evan did not hold the restricted snake permit required in Ohio for Burmese pythons, and the case was logged as an unregistered ownership violation. The incident stayed local, mentioned only once in a small community paper focused on reptile care safety. Travis later surrendered his own animals, recognizing how subtle husbandry issues can escalate. The bedroom was cleared within days, leaving only faint disinfectant and plywood odors behind. The python attack started with small oversights that built up quietly, but the next story shows how danger can erupt even faster, when an ordinary morning with a restless house cat suddenly shifts into a burst of redirected aggression. It was May 12, 2018 in Portland, Oregon. A cool, quiet morning settled over the second-floor apartment, but inside one unit, days of growing tension were aligning toward a sudden, unnoticed breaking point. Lena Ortiz, 32, worked as a freelance graphic designer from home. Her schedule shifted constantly, and the irregular hours often kept her awake long past midnight, leaving her mornings slow and quiet. She lived with her Bengal cat, Milo, who she had adopted 3 years earlier when a previous owner surrendered him due to his energy level. Lena enjoyed the structure of caring for him, and despite the challenges of owning a high-drive hybrid breed, she believed she understood his moods well enough to manage him safely. Her work required long stretches at her desk, and she often reassured herself that Milo's pacing and occasional agitation were just part of his temperament, not signs of a deeper issue. The apartment overlooked an alley with a small feral cat colony, which kept Milo on edge. He paced, vocalized, and pawed at the blinds. Construction noise during the week heightened his agitation. Scratch marks appeared on the window frame, and Jess occasionally heard him growling at movement outside. That morning, sunlight caught on dust drifting through the air, and the apartment carried the smells of coffee and the faint musk of cat fur. The alley below echoed with a brief skirmish between two feral tomcats, their yowls carrying up to the second floor. Inside, Milo's body stiffened, and his tail snapped sharply from side to side as he pressed against the window blinds, trying to see the source of the noise. The room felt close, the air heavy with a tension that neither woman recognized as dangerous. Lena approached with the intention of guiding him away and settling him before starting her workday, unaware of how close he was to a full arousal spike. Bengal cats, particularly those with higher percentages of wild lineage, retain strong predatory and territorial responses. They are sensitive to sound, movement, and visual stimuli, and can exhibit redirected aggression when they are unable to reach the source of their agitation. In high arousal states, their reactions can be fast and severe, driven less by intent and more by instinctual overstimulation. Their musculature is dense for their size, and their hind legs allow powerful kicking motions, capable of causing deep scratches or punctures. In the minutes leading to the attack, several warnings were visible. Milo's ears remained pinned forward, his tail jerked rapidly, and he emitted a low, continuous yowl directed at the movement outside. Jess, from the kitchen, heard it and assumed it would pass, having witnessed similar behavior before. The earlier fight between the tomcats had left Milo's body rigid with tension. The construction noise in the alley had already agitated him repeatedly throughout the week, and the scratches on the window frame showed clear signs of escalating frustration. Lena, used to his vocalizations, reached toward his shoulders without pausing to assess his posture, likely assuming a gentle touch would diffuse the moment. The shift from stillness to violence was immediate. As Lena's hand came down on Milo's back, he whipped around and latched onto her forearm with his front claws. His rear legs struck in rapid succession, raking down her skin in parallel lines. Jess, hearing the sudden thud of movement against the wall, looked up to see Milo clinging to Lena's arm as she tried to pull away. The cat's grip tightened, each kick deepening the cuts. When Lena attempted to stand, Milo climbed upward, using her shirt for traction, and targeted her cheek and scalp with fast, repeated bites. Jess crossed the room with a blanket, trying to create a barrier, but Milo struck out as she reached forward, leaving a jagged mark across her wrist. The attack continued for several seconds more, before Jess managed to wrap the blanket around Milo's torso, creating just enough separation for Lena to pull back. Milo thrashed briefly inside the fabric before Jess carried him to the bathroom and shut the door, isolating him from further contact. Blood droplets trailed from the living room to the hallway, marking the short but severe struggle. The apartment fell silent, broken only by Lena's unsteady breathing. The attack had lasted less than a minute, but the injuries were substantial. Puncture wounds ran across her cheek and near her eyelid, and deep scratches lined her forearm. Jess called emergency services, and paramedics arrived to treat the wounds before transporting Lena for further evaluation. Milo remained confined, the bathroom door reinforced with a towel beneath the gap to prevent escape. Lena survived the incident, but required microsuturing around the eyelid and follow-up care to monitor for infection. Animal Control conducted a mandatory 10-day observation period for Milo, ultimately determining that the attack stemmed from redirected aggression rather than inherent viciousness. They did not seize him permanently, but noted the incident in their internal records. The case received almost no public attention, appearing only as a small item in a neighborhood bulletin describing an indoor pet aggression call. Jess moved out 2 months later, saying the incident changed how she viewed high-drive cats in small spaces. By autumn, the apartment was repainted and re-leased, the scratched window frame the only trace of how quickly a routine morning had turned violent. People often assume exotic pets are the risky ones, but the next story shows how even a well-loved domestic breed can become dangerous when agitation keeps building behind a closed apartment window. It was September 3rd, 2016, in Bakersfield, California. The late summer heat settled over the neighborhood in a steady, heavy quiet, the kind that made the air feel slow. Nothing unusual moved across the backyard fences, yet small, familiar habits were already shifting just enough to set the stage for a preventable accident that no one fully recognized. Marcia Delton, 54, worked part-time as a bookkeeper and spent most afternoons tending to her small garden and the animals she kept as companions. She had adopted a sulcata tortoise named Buster 8 years earlier from an overwhelmed hobbyist who could no longer care for him. Marcia took pride in maintaining a routine, feeding, cleaning, and gentle interaction, believing her attentiveness had helped the tortoise settle into a stable, predictable life. Her backyard was her main sanctuary, and caring for Buster gave structure to her days, especially after shifting to part-time work the year before. Neighbors mostly saw Marcia moving quietly through her yard, carrying feed bowls or tending small patches of weeds. From her kitchen window, Aileen often caught glimpses of her daily routine and had recently noticed Buster trailing closer behind her than before. Marcia mentioned his appetite had grown with the heat, and he pressed against her legs at feeding time, a change she brushed off as seasonal. The yard itself showed signs of late summer, dry, uneven soil, pockets of turned dirt near the shed, and narrow walkways where shade barely reached. Spaces Marcia moved through without much caution. Sulcata tortoises, particularly adults nearing 70 pounds, are powerful herbivores with strong, stocky limbs and a natural tendency to push forward when navigating obstacles. While not aggressive predators, they can exhibit assertive food-seeking behavior, especially during periods of increased appetite. Their forward momentum can come quickly for their size, and once engaged in a pushing motion, they continue with steady, unyielding force, using their domed shells as leverage against surfaces or objects. Several warnings had been building in the days leading up to the incident. Buster's increased pacing before meals, the more frequent nudging against Marcia's legs, and the proximity with which he trailed her around the yard all indicated heightened food motivation. The uneven ground added instability, and the narrow corridor near the shed reduced her ability to move away quickly. Earlier that morning, Aileen had seen Buster circling near the shed for several minutes, an unusual behavior she interpreted as anticipation for feeding time. Marcia, carrying a metal bowl of chopped vegetables, seemed unaware of how tightly these small factors were converging. As she stepped into the shaded strip beside the shed and turned to lower the bowl, Buster surged forward with surprising speed for his size. His shell struck the back of her calf, knocking her off balance. The dry soil shifted beneath her feet, and she fell backward into the narrow space. Before she could rise, the tortoise advanced again, pressing his weight forward until her back met the wooden shed wall. Aileen, who had been rinsing dishes, looked out just in time to see Marcia's feet kicking against the dirt. Aileen rushed outside, calling out for Marcia as she crossed the yard. Buster maintained steady pressure, his front limbs braced and shell angled upward as he pushed. Marcia attempted to shift sideways, but the confined space between the shed and the garden bed left little room. Each time she tried to lift herself, Buster's weight pressed her down, his movements slow but firm. Aileen attempted to push him away at the shell's edge, but his mass barely shifted. Realizing she needed leverage, Aileen grabbed a shovel leaning near the garden bed. She wedged the handle between Buster's shell and the shed wall, applying steady pressure. After several seconds, the tortoise shifted just enough for Marcia to pull one leg free and slide sideways out of the narrow corridor. Buster continued to press forward for a moment before settling, his attention fixed on the dropped bowl. The yard fell quiet again once the immediate struggle ended. Marcia remained on the ground, breathing unsteadily, unable to put weight on her left side. The impact of the fall and the force of Buster's shell had left her in significant pain. Aileen called emergency services, and paramedics transported Marcia to the hospital, where scans revealed a fractured hip and internal bruising. She survived, but required prolonged rehabilitation. Animal control and a local rescue organization later assessed Buster, determining that his behavior stemmed from strong food motivation rather than aggression. He was rehomed to a regional tortoise sanctuary with more space and controlled feeding conditions. The incident received only a brief mention in a small gardening newsletter, as a reminder of the risks associated with large herbivores in confined backyard settings. In the months that followed, Marcia redesigned her yard with separate feeding zones and wider walkways, adjusting her routines to avoid narrow areas and unpredictable footing. The shed wall, previously marked by the tortoise's shell, served as a quiet reminder of how an ordinary afternoon feeding had shifted unexpectedly into a dangerous moment driven by instinct and circumstance. The last case showed how slow, steady force can trap someone before they realize the danger. But the next incident is the opposite. Here, a split-second sound inside a quiet home triggers an airborne attack no one expected. It was November 14, 2015, in Tampa, Florida. The house appeared calm from the outside, but inside, rising tension and repeated arguments were quietly pushing a sensitive household pet toward an unseen breaking point. Trevor Marsh, 27, worked long shifts in a hands-on maintenance job, often returning home drained and irritable. He had moved in with his sister Marcy, 25, only 6 months earlier to save money during his training period, fully intending it to be temporary. Their arrangement worked on the surface, shared rent, shared chores, but underlying frustration simmered as bills fluctuated and schedules clashed. Marcy's green-winged macaw, Rico, was part of the house long before Trevor arrived. The bird occupied a large corner perch in the living room, a space Trevor had to cross repeatedly each day. He tried to keep his movements controlled, but his natural pace, quick, purposeful steps, sometimes startled the macaw, causing sharp vocalizations that only added to household strain. Marcy, who worked in a small dental office nearby, had raised Rico for nearly 15 years. The bird was deeply bonded to her, trusting her touch and responding to her voice. But he remained highly reactive to sudden changes in tone or movement. Marcy had registered Rico under the FWC personal pet permit years earlier, a requirement she renewed annually. Over the previous week, arguments had sparked between the siblings over utilities and scheduling. Each time a voice rose above normal conversation levels, Rico responded with wing flaring or loud squawks. Marcy noticed the behavior but interpreted it as typical macaw sensitivity. The landlord, who lived in the adjacent unit and often overheard household noise, had knocked twice in recent days to ask if everything was all right, but nothing seemed serious enough to warrant concern. The living room was small, with a couch along one wall, and Rico's perch by the window. Warm air carried faint bird dander and pine shavings despite the air conditioner. Outside, humidity pressed inward. Trevor moved through the tight space quickly while Rico shifted on his perch, feathers lifted in mild agitation. Green-winged macaws are large parrots with strong beaks capable of cracking nuts and exerting significant pressure when alarmed. Their instinctive responses rely heavily on environmental cues, changes in volume, body language, or sudden motion. When startled or overstimulated, they may launch from their perch and use a defensive bite to anchor themselves. While not inherently aggressive, their size and strength mean a fearful reaction can result in serious injury. Rico's long-term bond with Marcy made him predictable with her, but less so with fast movement or unfamiliar body cues from others. Warnings had accumulated quietly over the prior days. Rico had begun flaring his wings more frequently, especially when voices escalated. He retreated deeper into his perch when Trevor passed through the room too quickly, often raising his head feathers in a display of uncertainty. Earlier that afternoon, while the siblings exchanged tense words over a miscalculated bill, the bird shifted repeatedly, his tail feathers flicking against the metal bar. The landlord paused on his porch when he heard the argument rise, though he didn't intervene. As the discussion grew sharper, Trevor stepped through the living room toward the kitchen, his tone shifting abruptly. That change, sharp, loud and unexpected, was the final trigger for Rico's startled response. As Trevor moved past the perch, Rico launched into the air with a rapid beat of wings. The motion was sudden and direct. A flight path angled upward before dipping toward Trevor's face. Marcy saw the arc clearly. Rico's wings flared wide, his body leaning forward as he latched onto the soft tissue just beneath Trevor's left eye. Trevor stumbled, grabbing the side of the cage to steady himself as the macaw clamped down in a defensive grip. The pressure of the beak, designed to break shells and hard surfaces, drove sharply into the skin around the eye, causing immediate bleeding. Trevor attempted to pull back, but Rico held firm, his talons hooking lightly into Trevor's shoulder for balance. Marcy rushed forward with a towel, hesitating for a moment as she tried to avoid injuring the bird. Her indecision allowed the struggle to continue several seconds longer. Trevor's breathing grew uneven as he bent slightly, trying to reduce the angle of Rico's bite. His free hand remained braced on the cage, muscles tense. In the adjoining unit, the landlord heard the impact of the struggle and hurried through the shared entryway, entering the living room as Marcy finally wrapped the towel around the bird's body. Together, Marcy and the landlord secured the towel around Rico's wings and torso, easing pressure away from Trevor's face. With coordinated effort, they managed to detach the macaw's beak from the torn tissue beneath the eye. Rico, still wrapped, was placed inside a spare travel cage to prevent further agitation. Trevor sat against the couch armrest, holding a clean cloth over his eye while Marcy called emergency services. Paramedics arrived quickly, noting deep eyelid lacerations and corneal damage before transporting Trevor to the hospital, where specialists confirmed partial vision loss. Rico later underwent a behavioral assessment but stayed with Marcy under stricter guidelines. The incident remained private, mentioned only in a brief homeowner's memo. Trevor moved out months later, leaving Marcy with a changed living room and a lasting reminder of the event. The macaw's attack happened in a heartbeat. What follows is far slower and far more unforgiving, where strength, not speed, became the deciding factor. And once the pressure started, there was no room for the victim to escape. It was April 17, 2016, in rural Brenham, Texas. The farm seemed calm under the midday heat, unaware that familiar routines between an owner and her stallion were quietly drifting toward a fatal turning point. June Carter, 38, ran a modest homestead where she kept a few chickens, a backyard garden, and a single stallion named Rowdy. She worked part-time at the county feed store and kept the property herself, treating the animals as companions rather than livestock. Rowdy had been hers since he was a colt. She'd raised him from weaning, trained him herself, and registered him in her name. Neighbors described her as hands-on and deeply attached. She groomed him daily, hand-fed treats, and preferred riding alone down quiet dirt lanes. The relationship was affectionate and familiar, and June's handling reflected years of trust that, over time, softened formal boundaries between owner and animal. She couldn't afford professional trainers, but Rowdy responded to her calmly, so she relied on their long bond. He lived in a small stall behind the barn, close enough for her to check on him throughout the day. He wasn't a working horse. He was her personal pet and companion. The barn was warm with hay and dust, and the narrow alley near his stall left little space to avoid a sudden push if he moved forward unexpectedly. Adult stallions are powerful animals, well over 1,000 pounds in large breeds, with a low center of gravity and strong hindquarters built for forward momentum. They can shift weight quickly and brace a flank against a surface to apply unrelenting pressure. When triggered, a stallion's natural forward thrust is slow but overwhelmingly heavy. It does not require speed to cause crushing force against a fixed object. Inexperienced handling, blurred human-animal boundaries, or misread body language can quickly turn a routine interaction into a dangerous entrapment. That spring, Rowdy grew more restless at feeding time, pawing at the stall floor and nudging June's legs when she delayed. Neighbors noticed him trailing her closely, and once saw him shove a gatepost during a brief dispute over fencing. June dismissed it as stubbornness. That morning, returning late from the feed store, she entered the narrow alley, unaware that Rowdy's posture had tightened behind her. As she bent, Rowdy moved forward with a steady, forceful step. The stallion's shoulder struck the small of her back, driving her weight forward so that she stumbled against the stall frame. The impact was not dramatic in sound, but it was decisive in force. June's torso met the wooden post, and Rowdy continued to press, angling his massive chest and neck in a slow, sustained shove, rather than repeated blows. Her arms hooked for support on the stall door, Her feet scrabbled for purchase on uneven straw. The neighbor, Eli, who was repairing a fence 10 yards away, heard a dull thud and a low, distressed sound. He looked up to see Rowdy braced, head lowered, body angled as he pushed June back against the stall wall. June tried to step to the side, but the alley's width allowed only minimal movement. Each attempt to lift herself triggered more pressure. Rowdy's mass did not surge so much as it settled, driving downward weight against her ribs and chest. The stallion's movements were steady, not frantic, an unrelenting application of force that compressed her torso against the timber. Eli crossed the yard and called out while grabbing a bucket handle to throw toward the stall in a bid to distract the horse. But the stallion's focus remained on the pinned figure. He reached the stable door and shoved at the animal's shoulder. Rowdy braced harder, shifting the crush point across June's chest. The compression impeded breathing. Observers later described her attempts to inhale as shallow, each breath harder than the last. June's arms went slack as rib motion became ineffective. Eli, joined by another neighbor, Ramona, tried to lever the stallion away by twisting a lead rope that had been looped on a nearby post, but Rowdy's weight and the narrow stall geometry prevented any immediate displacement. Within minutes, paramedics were on site after a frantic call. By then, June had lost consciousness. Medical responders performed extrication procedures and provided chest decompression efforts, but the prolonged compression had caused fatal internal trauma, multiple rib fractures, flail chest mechanics, and rapid internal bleeding. She was pronounced dead at the scene. June's phone was found on the barn floor with its screen cracked, an unfinished video file still open from when she had set it on a shelf before working. Her toolbox lay scattered, a few screws kicked loose during the struggle. Rowdy stood quietly in his stall, breathing heavily, but showing no predatory behavior when responders arrived. Witness statements and a brief, shaky neighbor video confirmed the slow, compressive force rather than a frantic attack. A veterinarian and animal control officers later determined the stallion's behavior stemmed from space and resource fixation, recommending transfer to a facility with experienced handlers. The coroner listed blunt thoracic trauma with internal hemorrhage as the cause of death. Local coverage remained minimal, noted only as a farm accident, but neighbors quietly adjusted their own barns. Wider aisles, clearer feeding zones, while the property carried the memory of a familiar routine that had turned irreversible within seconds. Thanks for watching. Enjoy this video? Click more